Are cybersecurity regulations a benefit for your organization, or are they a curse?
This is a Security Weekly production. Security Weekly is a resource of Cyber Risk Alliance.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative, in conjunction with Cyber Reason, is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Mark Burnette, shareholder in charge, LBMC Security, and former CISO of several large organizations.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you, and thank you for what you're doing to help educate security leaders in our profession. Your CISO Compass book is outstanding, and I know many are benefiting from the wisdom that you've conveyed, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of my insights.
Well, thank you.
Just a little bit about how I got into cybersecurity. I started my career at one of what was then the big six accounting firms. And back then, all those firms were looking to begin cybersecurity consulting. They had offered IT audit for a long period of time, and that's what I was hired in to do. But the firm that I was at was starting to really double down on cybersecurity. And I stuck my hand up and said, hey, I think I'd like to do that. And that kind of got me exposed to people who really knew what they were doing and understood the nuances of cybersecurity and then the distinctions really between security and audit and compliance and those types of things. And so that started me on my journey.
Excellent. And I know that you've been, around quite a while. You've received several, awards in cybersecurity. And I know in your consulting practice that you're with now, you see a lot that's out there. And I'd like to dive into your piece that you wrote. The benefits of focusing on risk versus compliance. And you started off in there and talked about the irony that business leaders, security leaders have to deal with. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely, Todd. So, the good news is that for those of us in cybersecurity, we have job security, and we have it because almost every day, you can pick up a newspaper and you can read about another organization that suffered a security incident of some kind. However, in the minds of many business leaders, a lot of the thought really is around regulatory and compliance obligations because for a few reasons. First of all, they're front and center. They're something that we hear about all the time. Compliance officers are whispering in the ear. Heads of internal audit are whispering in the ear. The audit committee is obviously interested in those things, and they're important for organizations to understand and do. But the challenge for an executive is that they think a lot about compliance, and they think, hey, when we get to the point where we're compliant, we can stop running the race. And but for those of us in security, we know that compliance rarely equals effective risk management. And so the irony is that we do have some drivers that can help get visibility to parts of our program and can help get the organization on track with funding some of the initiatives that need to truly help address cybersecurity issues. But the challenge is that a lot of times the business leaders get stuck in that compliance mindset, and the security executive's goal should really be to discourage that mindset and focus on managing risk to a level the organization is willing to accept.
So if we have all these, these laws, these regulations, I mean, we have plenty of them. We look at HIPAA and PCI, and then, we layer in all the control frameworks that we have on top of it. I think I remember I was writing about these, and I got to about 13 of them, and just they were getting kind of repetitive. They all talk about very similar things. So are those regulations? Are they over the top in what they're asking for? How do we address that?
Yeah, Todd, I think one thing I would say is this. You alluded to there's some regulations, obviously some laws, and obviously there are some regulations that are laws, and there are some that are not laws. For example, PCI is not a law in and of itself. It is a regulation, created by the credit card industry. So if you don't comply with PCI, nobody really goes to jail because of that. But certainly, there could be other implications, fines, penalties, revoking the ability to use credit cards. But other regulations are laws, and there may be within the law specified some penalties that could lead to to jail time or other types of issues for executives. So, but I like to start with the frameworks. And as you said, there are a ton of cybersecurity frameworks. And Todd, my advice to security leaders is don't get caught up in trying to understand the details of all of the frameworks. Pick one and stay in that lane and work your program towards that framework, because they're all designed to achieve the same objective. And if you try to figure out how to address all of them, you're probably going to get bogged down in minutia and details and all of that. And so any one of those frameworks is going to help move an organization towards a reasonably implemented cybersecurity program. Pick the one that makes the most sense for your entity. So start there. And by the way, there are guidance that you can find on the different frameworks and which one might make sense. For example, international organizations might choose ISO 27001. Organizations based in the US might choose the NIST CSF or 853 or something like that. Organizations in healthcare might choose the HITRUST CSF. So there's different reasons why you might choose different ones, but they all get you to the same place. I like to use the analogy of, for those that are familiar with the Bible, the most published and read book in the world, there's a bunch of different translations of the Bible. But you can read any translation and you can find your way to the meaning and the message. And that's the same with these cybersecurity frameworks. So the first thing I would say is start with the framework and focus your program around the framework. Now, with the regulations, obviously the industry you're in and the jurisdiction you're in, all of that might impact the regulations that apply to your organization, and you need to be mindful of those. But I continue to contend that organizations that truly use a cybersecurity framework and look to manage their risk to a level that the company is willing to accept will, by their very nature, achieve compliance with the regulations that are applicable to their organization.
So really flipping that around then, and looking at the framework first to drive compliance with the regulations.
Yes. And of course, all of the major frameworks have mappings to the regulations. So it's relatively, and they're freely available. So it's relatively easy if you've picked your framework to quickly say, okay, well, my lawyers tell me these 3 regulations apply, or, my consultants tell me I might need to consider this regulation. Well, let me find the mapping and let me just see where that regulation maps into my control framework. And then you can focus on, I've already got these controls in place, and, so I'm okay. Or, I haven't addressed that that control area. I need to spend some time there in order to make sure I'm addressing the regulation.
And you bring up a very good point that we need to look at the different, where we are in terms of what framework to pick. Like I know when I worked for a large global organization, I intentionally chose ISO because I knew, that would play better internationally at the time than NIST would. And I know that NIST now is becoming more accepted in places like Europe and Australia, and places like that are adopting that framework as well. But in the beginning, that really wasn't the case. And I was trying to avoid having a US centric type of framework. So you bring up a very good point about, understanding that culture as to where to go with that.
Yeah, Todd, that's absolutely, it is integral to be thinking about that when thinking about, which framework might be the best for you to hang your hat on.
Yeah. So now you talk about, the security risk management and making good decisions around that. In one of the key things that you just mentioned were determining that risk appetite of the organization. What have you found is really the best way to really understand that?
Well, I've seen, obviously the risk appetite is largely determined by the tone at the top. So the senior management of the company is going to have a risk appetite. And, Todd, when we think about risk, companies face risk all the time, and it's not just cybersecurity risk. And so as a chief security officer, we need to be thinking about, well, there's financial risk and there's business risk and, all other kinds of risks that come into play. And so the company as a whole is going to have a risk posture. And so the CISO can get some tips from seeing how the company is insulating itself or addressing other risks that it faces to get some idea of, hey, how is the company going to be when it comes time to, when I'm putting forward cybersecurity risks? So you need to spend time with the senior executives. The second component, of course, will be if the company is a regulated or a publicly traded company, it's likely to have an audit committee or a board of directors. And that board or that audit committee is certainly going to influence the risk appetite of the company and is going to provide some direction to the CEO and other company leaders regarding what's appropriate and acceptable. And so being able to get access to that board and get some insights maybe from the board chair, the audit committee chair can be helpful to the CISO as well as he or she thinks about what the appropriate risk appetite is.
Yeah. And how do you, where you have these regulations, have you had these situations where you have some of the executives that they say, well, we know that's what's in the regulation, but we're willing to take more risk. How do you address that?
Yes, absolutely. And ultimately, as a security leader, and I spent 9 years, Todd, as a chief security officer for 2 different publicly traded companies. And I came to the realization that my job as a CISO was I needed to advise and educate senior management about the security risk facing the company, and then help them make well-informed decisions about those risks. And I needed to be okay that if their well-informed decision was not the recommendation that I would have made or the decision I would have made, I needed to be okay with that and be able to sleep at night. And so it was only in the situations if I felt like they were making not well-informed decisions that, I would be concerned. And that was on me because ultimately as a CISO, we have the responsibility to communicate to those business executives the risk in a manner that they can understand. And I think that's probably one of the biggest tricks or challenges that a CISO faces. You address it in your book. A number of my colleagues who provided some content for you, I know made some references as well to the fact that the security leader really needs to focus on the messaging and make sure that we don't get caught up in the bits and bytes, the pings, packets, ports, and firewalls, because most business executives won't be super technologically savvy, but they are extremely intelligent and they can certainly understand risk. And so really need to focus on making sure that we're advising and educating the management team about those risks, and then let them make a well-informed decision. And we have to understand that there may be factors outside of our own knowledge, our own information about the company that caused them to make the decision that they made.
The article this podcast is based upon can be viewed in the best-selling cybersecurity leadership book, CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, available at Amazon.com and other booksellers. Great.
And Todd, one more point on that, though. I ultimately, as a CISO, I would say this: if you do feel like you are, passionately carrying the mantle for security, and that you're educating and advising and all of that, and that the company still is just they're running through the stop sign, then as a CISO, that's when you may need to look at another organization, because we know history has shown that when the breaches do happen, many times the spotlight is shined on the CISO, and the CISO is a scapegoat. And so if you're at an organization that's just brazen in their operations, and it is, uncomfortably brazen for you, and you can't find a good justification for those decisions, it may be time to look for another organization.
What are some of those things that you've seen as a CISO that where you've been compliant with a regulation, but there's some security controls that weren't covered. Do you have an example of that?
Well, an example that many people will be familiar with is HIPAA, which is the security regulation that applies to protected health information. So it's the health data on American citizens that is maintained by organizations. And HIPAA has some safeguards that it prescribes, but they're very generic. The guidance provided in the HIPAA law is very generic, and it was purposefully generic. And that was designed to give entities lots of latitude in terms of how they would choose to implement the safeguards. Okay, so that was intentional. And it's a blessing and a curse for security leaders, because the blessing is it does provide some flexibility to put a program around putting those controls in place. The reason it's a curse is it does not really establish a minimum bar. And so in many cases, you'll find that where generally accepted leading practices are good practices today in security are headed. And, where those of us, as we hang in security circles and we talk to our peers say, oh, well, this is really the minimum standard of okay right now. That may be higher than where the organization wants to go. And, absent any specific guidance in HIPAA, then the security leaders got to figure out a way to make up that delta. So that's a specific example of a regulation that provides some high level oversight, but not really a minimum bar. And in many cases, if organizations are focused only on saying, hey, can we check the box that we comply with HIPAA, they may not, and likely have not, if they've only focused on that, done enough to truly address all of the cybersecurity risks that's going to face their organization. And not only that, Todd, but HIPAA, of course, only focuses on that protected health information. There is other types of sensitive data that most organizations that have HIPAA data are going to have, that if they only focus on, protecting PHI, that other data may not be a focus and may not be protected at all.
Yeah, they may have, intellectual property within their organization.
Yes. Intellectual property, personally identifiable information, PII, cardholder data, all kinds of sensitive data that isn't accounted for at all in HIPAA. But certainly if it's within the control of the company, they would want it protected.
Yeah, and I think we had moved into this whole risk management era after the compliance era, where all these laws came out with, because everybody was, checking all the boxes and saying we're HIPAA compliant, and you had vendors selling products that said we're HIPAA compliant, which kind of missed the holistic view of everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that was one of those things that those of us who were CISOs at the time, we knew very quickly that if a vendor said, hey, our product will get you HIPAA compliant, we knew that, that vendor wasn't one that you'd want to have a conversation with, because, there wasn't a product, there still isn't a product that in and of itself can, help can make an organization compliant with, pick your rule, because it's all about, there's policies, processes, and people, that all come together, and there's no one silver bullet that can address that.
What do you think are some of those risks that we're missing today in all the regulations and control frameworks that we have?
One I'll refer back to, I just mentioned in my previous comments, which is the idea that we need to make sure that all types of sensitive data are accounted for in our programs, and that if we are really laser focused on, the data that's regulated, then we may only be applying the sets of controls to the data that's regulated, but there's other, sensitive data that needs to be protected that would put us at harm and put us at risk. So I think that's a big one. Another one would really be, I think, around it's less of a risk, I think, and more of a challenge. And it really gets back to the beginning of our conversation, the communication with the senior management within the company, and making sure that they clearly understand cybersecurity. They understand their duty and responsibility as senior executives for making key decisions for funding of the appropriate security controls, and then making sure that those controls are functioning as intended.
Do you think we're getting better at that?
Yeah, well, yes, we are getting better at it. Yes, absolutely. And I think we're getting better at it both from a broadness, meaning more organizations are doing it, are starting to do those things. And then secondly, we're getting better at it from an effectiveness of execution. So yes, Todd, I think we're getting better both at more companies doing it, and the ones that are doing it, I believe, are continuing to get more effective, which is a nod to the fact that auditors have increased their skills, their understanding of cyber, and they've gotten better at being able to help in evaluating those controls, and that those that are responsible for executing those controls have a better understanding of how they should apply.
Yeah, very good insight. So what final thoughts do you want to leave our listeners with around this push-pull between compliance and security?
I think that the most important thing for a security leader to be successful is really being an effective communicator. I tell people all the time, you can learn the details of security. You can if you want to be an expert in encryption, you can learn that. If you want to be an expert in identity management, pick any of the disciplines. You can learn that through studies, through attending class, and things like that. It is much more difficult to truly learn to be a good communicator. And I think that's where all of us need to focus, because ultimately a security leader's success hinges even more on his or her ability to garner support for the controls, the programs, the frameworks, the funding, all the things that are needed to actually manage risk to an acceptable level. And so it doesn't matter how good we are, how much we know about what controls should be in place, or how strongly we feel about it. If we can't get other people within the organization on board with the idea, the concept, such that they're willing to support it with money and with, by signing off on the policies and carrying out their duties and things like that, then it's all for naught. So I would say, as security leaders, we need to be continually focused on the messaging, on being good communicators. And if you're someone who has been told by mentors, by colleagues, or by superiors in the past that that's an area where you need to focus, I would encourage you strongly to double down on that and make sure that you are truly focusing on being able to communicate effectively with your business partners and with others in the organization.
Well, thanks a lot, Mark. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thanks a lot for all that you're doing within the industry to evangelize security. Really appreciate it.
Todd, thank you so much for having me. It's great to chat with you again, and I hope everyone out there stays secure.
Thank you.
Cybereason is the champion for today's defenders, providing an endpoint security platform to prevent, detect, and respond to malicious operations on computers, mobile devices, servers, and the cloud. Cybereason. End cyber attacks from endpoints to the enterprise to everywhere. Learn more at cybereason.com/CISO stories.